There is a memory your soulmate thought had finally gone quiet until someone unexpectedly brought it back to life with just a few words. They probably weren't expecting to hear anything about that old chapter of their life that day. It may have started as an ordinary conversation, nothing serious, nothing that seemed connected to you. And then suddenly, someone mentioned a promise you both made long ago. The moment those words reached your soulmate, something inside them changed. They may have gone quiet for a second, looked away, or tried to continue the conversation as though it meant nothing. But deep down they remembered. Not vaguely, not like some distant memory that had faded with time. They remembered the moment, the atmosphere around you, the way you looked at them, and perhaps even the exact feeling they had when they made that promise. It was one of those moments that felt permanent when it happened, because neither of you imagined that life would eventually take you in different directions. Back then, the future probably seemed simple. You trusted each other. You believed there would always be another conversation, another chance, another moment to make things right if life ever became complicated. But somewhere along the way, things changed. Distance appeared. Silence became normal. And eventually, your soulmate may have convinced themselves that the promise belonged to a chapter that was already finished. Until now, because someone just reminded them of it, and suddenly the past doesn't feel as far away as they thought. They may have wondered why that particular memory still carries so much emotional weight after all this time. Why can they remember your face so clearly? Why can they still hear the words you said? Why does something they thought they had accepted suddenly feel unfinished again? Imagine finding an old letter tucked away somewhere years after you stopped reading it, only to open it and realize that every word still knows exactly where to hurt you. That may be what this reminder did to your soulmate. It didn't simply make them remember you. It made them remember who they were when they were with you. And perhaps the most unsettling part is that they are now wondering whether you remember that promise too. Because if you do, then there may be something about that moment they never truly finished confronting. And before they can push the memory away again, one specific part of that promise may come rushing back, the part they now realize they never actually kept. The promise itself may have been simple when you made it, but now that your soulmate has been reminded of it, they may be realizing just how much meaning was hidden inside those words. At the time, neither of you probably stopped to calculate everything that could happen later. You weren't thinking about distance, misunderstandings, silence, or the possibility that one day you would barely speak. You were simply two people who believed the connection between you was strong enough to survive whatever came next. Maybe the promise was about always finding your way back to each other. Maybe it was about never becoming strangers. Maybe it was about being there when life became difficult. Whatever those words were, your soulmate may have believed them completely when they said them. And that is exactly why hearing them again now feels so different. They aren't remembering the promise as the same person who made it. They are remembering it as someone who has already lived through the consequences of not keeping it. Imagine standing in a place you haven't visited for years and suddenly recognizing everything. The same doorway, the same light, the same feeling you had when you were there. For a moment, time almost disappears. That may be what happened emotionally when someone reminded your soulmate of those words. They may have suddenly been transported back to the version of themselves who looked at you and believed there would always be time. They may remember your expression, the sound of your voice, the seriousness behind the conversation, and the certainty that existed between you before everything became complicated. But then reality returns. They remember what happened afterward. They remember the distance. They remember the moments when communication became difficult. They remember the things that were left unsaid. And perhaps that is when the promise stops feeling like a beautiful memory and starts feeling like a question. Did I really keep my word? Your soulmate may have thought they had moved beyond that question because life became busy and enough time passed to make the past feel less immediate. But some promises don't disappear just because people stop talking about them. They remain quietly attached to certain places, songs, dates, conversations, or even random words spoken by someone else. And sometimes all it takes is one unexpected reminder to bring the entire emotional world back. Your soulmate may now be wondering whether you ever thought about that promise after the two of you separated. Did you remember it when you were alone? Did you ever wonder why they stopped trying to fulfill it? Did you believe their promise was genuine when they made it, or did you eventually decide that their actions had proven otherwise? Those questions can be painful because your soulmate may suddenly realize that the promise was not only something they said to you, it was something you trusted. And there is a difference between forgetting a sentence and breaking something another person built hope around. Maybe your soulmate remembers how natural it felt to make that promise. Maybe there was laughter before it. Maybe there was silence afterward because both of you understood that something important had just been said. They may remember thinking, "Of course we'll do this." There was no reason to doubt it then. The future still felt open. But now they may be looking backward and realizing that the future they imagined never unfolded the way they expected. They may wonder whether circumstances were truly responsible, or whether fear, pride, hesitation, or poor timing played a larger role than they wanted to admit. Perhaps there were moments when they could have chosen differently. Perhaps they could have reached out sooner. Perhaps they could have explained what they were feeling instead of disappearing into silence. And now that old promise becomes a reminder of every opportunity they allowed to pass. This is where the memory can become emotionally overwhelming. Because your soulmate isn't only remembering what you promised each other. They are remembering what they believed about themselves at that moment. They believed they were capable of keeping their word. They believed the connection was strong enough to survive distance. They believed that even if life separated you temporarily, the promise would somehow guide you back toward each other. And now they have to compare that belief with reality. Imagine writing a destination on a piece of paper and carrying it with you for years, convinced that one day you will finally arrive there, only to realize that somewhere along the journey you stopped following the map. The destination didn't disappear. You simply moved farther away from it. That may be how your soulmate feels about the promise now. They may not know whether it is still possible to honor it, but they suddenly understand that ignoring it didn't make it meaningless. And perhaps the most uncomfortable realization is that you may have taken those words more seriously than they ever understood. Maybe you didn't need them to repeat the promise every day. Maybe you simply believed that their actions would eventually match the words they gave you. When they didn't, you may have had to make a painful decision inside yourself. You may have realized that loving someone doesn't mean waiting indefinitely for them to become the person they promised to be. Your soulmate may now be wondering whether that was the moment you stopped believing in them. And if that thought has entered their mind, it can be difficult to push away. Because now the promise isn't just about what happened years ago. It is about what that promise means today. They may be wondering whether you still remember it, whether it still touches something inside you, or whether you have finally accepted that some promises belong to the past. And the more they replay that moment, the more one uncomfortable truth may begin to surface. They may not be haunted by the promise because they forgot it. They may be haunted because somewhere deep inside, they know they never truly finished what they started when they made it. The memory may have started as something nostalgic, but the longer your soulmate sits with it, the more it begins to change shape. At first, they may remember the promise with warmth. They may remember how certain everything felt, how naturally the words came out, and how neither of you seemed to imagine a future where you would become distant. But now, when they replay that moment, they don't just hear what was said. They remember everything that happened afterward. And that is where the emotional weight becomes much heavier. Because your soulmate may suddenly realize that the promise wasn't broken in one dramatic moment. It may have been broken through a series of small decisions, moments of hesitation, unanswered messages, emotional distance, pride, fear, or simply waiting for the other person to make the first move. They may start wondering whether one different decision could have changed the entire story between you. What if they had reached out when they wanted to? What if they had said what they were really feeling instead of hiding behind silence? What if they had understood what you needed before you stopped asking for it? These questions can become impossible to ignore once the memory is alive again. Imagine standing at the edge of a road and suddenly seeing every turn you could have taken differently. You cannot go back and choose another direction, but you can see exactly where each opportunity disappeared. That may be the emotional place your soulmate is entering now. They may remember the promise and realize that they once had complete faith in the future you both imagined, yet their own actions slowly moved that future further away. Perhaps they assumed there would always be another opportunity. Maybe they thought time would make things easier. Maybe they believed that if the connection was truly meant to be, nothing could permanently separate you. But life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes people don't lose each other because the connection wasn't real. They lose each other because neither person knows how to protect something real when fear, timing, pride, and misunderstanding get involved. And now your soulmate may be confronting the possibility that they were part of that process. They may wonder whether you looked at their actions and eventually came to a conclusion they never wanted you to reach. Maybe you stopped believing their words. Maybe you stopped trusting their promises. Maybe you decided that waiting for someone to fulfill a promise was hurting you more than accepting that it might never happen. Your soulmate may not know exactly when that shift occurred, but remembering the promise can make them search for it. They may think about the last time you spoke openly. They may remember the moment you became quieter. They may remember when you stopped asking questions. They may remember the first time your energy felt different. And suddenly, those memories connect together like pieces of a puzzle. What once seemed like separate moments may now look like a gradual goodbye. Not necessarily because you stopped caring, but because you were beginning to understand that caring alone could not create the future you had once imagined together. That realization can be painful for your soulmate because they may finally understand that you didn't necessarily walk away from the promise. They may have walked away from the version of themselves that kept asking you to wait. And now, when they think about the promise, they may wonder whether you still carry any belief in it. They may ask themselves whether you remember the words, but no longer trust the person who said them. There is a huge difference between those two things. Someone can remember every word and still stop believing in the possibility behind them. Your soulmate may suddenly fear that this is what happened to you. They may wonder whether you ever expected them to return, whether you once believed they would keep their word, and whether there came a point when you finally stopped expecting anything at all. And if they imagine that moment, it may create a kind of regret they weren't prepared for, because they may realize that while they were busy trying to understand their own feelings, you were learning how to live with the consequences of theirs. Perhaps they thought you would always understand their hesitation. Perhaps they believed you knew they cared even when they couldn't express it. But intentions don't always reach another person's heart. Sometimes what someone feels privately and what they communicate through their actions are two completely different stories. Your soulmate may now be seeing that difference more clearly than ever. The promise becomes a mirror, showing them not only what they wanted to be for you, but what they actually became. And that can be difficult to face. They may replay your face when the promise was made and wonder whether you could ever look at them with that same trust again. They may wonder whether too much time has passed, whether too much silence has happened, whether too many things were left unresolved. Yet the most haunting question may be much simpler. Did they believe me when I made that promise? Because if you did, then your soulmate may now understand the weight of what happened afterward. They weren't just failing to fulfill a sentence. They were failing to live up to something you believed was real. And somewhere in that realization, the memory stops feeling like a beautiful moment from the past and starts feeling like unfinished business. They may put their phone down, continue with their day, talk to other people, and still find that promise returning to their mind. They may hear your voice in their memory. They may remember the certainty in your eyes. They may remember how impossible it seemed that the two of you would ever become strangers. And now they are left wondering whether the distance between you was ever supposed to become permanent. More importantly, they may begin wondering whether you still remember the promise in the same way they do. Because if you remember it too, then they may have to face the possibility that the connection isn't haunting them simply because they miss you. It is haunting them because there is something they never finished saying, something they never finished doing, and something they may now be afraid they waited too long to make right. Now that the memory has fully resurfaced, your soulmate may begin wondering about something they hadn't allowed themselves to consider before. Whether you still remember that promise too. That question can become strangely persistent because they have no way of knowing what happened inside your heart after the two of you became distant. They may know what they did, what they said, and what eventually happened between you, but they don't know what you carried privately after everything changed. And that uncertainty can make the old promise feel even more powerful. They may start imagining your perspective, wondering whether there was ever a moment when you thought about those words and asked yourself why they were never fulfilled. Perhaps they wonder if you once waited for them to return. Perhaps they wonder if you believed they would eventually keep their word. Or perhaps the most painful possibility is that you remembered the promise for a long time and eventually had to teach yourself not to expect anything from it anymore. Your soulmate may realize that these are questions they cannot answer by simply remembering the past. They would have to know who you are now, and that may be exactly what scares them. Because time may have changed more than the circumstances between you. It may have changed you. Imagine two people looking at the same old photograph years later, but each person remembers a completely different story behind it. One remembers hope. The other remembers the moment that hope slowly disappeared. The photograph is the same, but the emotional meaning has changed. Your soulmate may now be wondering which version of that memory belongs to you. Did you keep it as something beautiful? Did it become painful? Did you eventually put it away because remembering it only reminded you of something that never happened? They may even wonder whether you would laugh if someone brought up that promise today, or whether you would become quiet because some part of you still remembers exactly what it meant. And this is where your soulmate may begin to understand something they didn't fully understand before. Your silence never gave them the answer. They may have interpreted your quietness in whatever way was most comfortable for them. Perhaps they thought you were angry. Perhaps they thought you were waiting. Perhaps they thought you had forgotten. But silence can mean many things, and sometimes it means someone has become tired of asking questions that never receive answers. Your soulmate may now wonder whether that was what happened to you. Maybe you didn't stop caring. Maybe you simply stopped asking the universe to return something that wasn't choosing to come back. That thought can hit hard because it changes the meaning of everything they remember. The promise may have once represented certainty, but now it represents possibility. And possibility is frightening when you don't know whether the other person still wants the same future. Your soulmate may start asking themselves whether they could ever approach you again without acknowledging what happened. Could they simply appear as though nothing changed? Could they bring up the old promise without admitting that they failed to honor it? Could they ask whether you still remember without risking the possibility that you might say, "I remember, but I don't believe in it anymore"? That possibility may be what keeps the memory alive, because your soulmate may not be afraid that you forgot the promise. They may be afraid that you remembered it so well that you eventually stopped believing the person who made it. And there is a painful difference between those two things. They may begin replaying specific moments when they could have acted differently. They may remember times when you gave them another chance to communicate. They may remember the moments when you were still emotionally open, still willing to listen, still hoping they would eventually explain what was happening inside them. And perhaps they now realize that the version of you who would have welcomed their return may not be the same version of you who exists today. You may have learned to protect your peace. You may have learned not to chase clarity from someone who isn't ready to give it. You may have learned that promises matter, but actions are what give promises their meaning. And if your soulmate recognizes that, they may begin feeling the weight of every moment when their actions failed to match their words. The old promise becomes a measuring line, and suddenly they can see exactly how far reality drifted from what they once said. They may wonder whether you ever noticed that distance. Of course you probably did, but your soulmate may not have understood what it meant at the time. They may have thought there was still plenty of time to repair things. Now they may be realizing that time was not waiting for either of you. It was quietly changing the emotional landscape between you. And perhaps that is why they can't stop replaying the original moment. They aren't simply trying to remember what you promised each other. They are trying to understand where everything went wrong after you made that promise. They may even imagine another version of the story where they kept their word, where the distance never became permanent, where you both found your way back before too much changed. But imagination cannot rewrite the past. It can only reveal what someone wishes they had done differently. And as your soulmate continues replaying that memory, one question may become louder than all the others. If they finally tried to honor that promise now, would you still be willing to hear them? And now, the memory may be reaching the point where your soulmate can no longer treat it as something that simply belongs to the past. The promise they once made to you has become a question about the present, and perhaps that is why they keep replaying the moment over and over again. They may remember the exact words, the way you looked at them, and the certainty they felt when they believed the future would give them endless opportunities to make those words true. But now they are looking at that memory from a completely different place. They know how much time has passed. They know how much has changed. And they may finally understand that promises are not protected by time alone. They are protected by choices. Every day someone chooses whether to move closer, whether to communicate, whether to keep showing up, and whether to honor what they once said. Your soulmate may now be realizing that while they were waiting for the perfect moment to do something about the promise, the moment they once had may have quietly disappeared. That realization can create a very specific kind of regret, because there is no way to return to the exact version of you who heard those words for the first time. They may still remember you, but they cannot know whether you still carry the same expectations. They may wonder whether you would even believe them if they repeated that promise today. Maybe that is the question that keeps them awake. If I said it again now, would they trust me? Because words that once felt powerful can feel completely different after silence. Your soulmate may finally understand that the promise itself was never the whole story. What mattered was what you believed would happen because of it. Maybe you believed they would come back. Maybe you believed they would never intentionally let the connection disappear. Maybe you believed that even if circumstances became difficult, there would always be an effort to find a way through them. And if none of that happened, then your soulmate may now be wondering how deeply that disappointment changed you. Perhaps you didn't wake up one morning and decide to forget them. Perhaps you simply reached a point where expecting something became more painful than accepting its absence. That is an important difference. You can remember someone without waiting for them. You can love what once existed without wanting to recreate it exactly as it was. You can still recognize the importance of a promise while accepting that the people who made it may have changed. And your soulmate may finally be beginning to understand that. The person they remember from that old moment may have believed in them completely. The person you are today may have learned that belief has to be supported by action. That realization could be why they feel so emotionally unsettled now. They are not only missing you, they are confronting the distance between who they promised to be and who they actually became. They may wonder whether they should reach out, whether they should finally speak about the promise, or whether doing so would only reopen something you have already healed from. They may be afraid that you will remember the promise, but respond with indifference. They may be afraid that you will tell them you once believed in it, but you no longer do. And yet, The fact that they are thinking about it again means that some part of them still considers the story unfinished. They may not know what the next chapter looks like, and neither do you. But they now have to acknowledge something they once avoided. The promise still carries emotional weight because you mattered when it was made. Perhaps the person who reminded them of it had no idea how deeply those few words would affect them. They may have thought they were simply mentioning an old memory. Instead, they reopened a door your soulmate had carefully kept closed. Behind that door was not only you, but the person your soulmate used to be, when they believed the two of you would keep your word to each other. And now they may be wondering whether there is still any path toward that promise, or whether its purpose was simply to show them what they once had and what they failed to protect. Maybe they will eventually reach out. Maybe they will remain silent because fear is stronger than courage. Maybe they will continue replaying that moment until they finally understand what they need to say. But whatever happens next, one thing has already changed. They can no longer pretend the promise meant nothing, because sometimes the memories that return years later are not asking us to go backward. They are asking us to finally understand what we couldn't understand when the moment was happening. And perhaps your soulmate's greatest realization is not that they still remember the promise. It is that they finally understand why you once believed every word, and why losing that belief may have been the real thing they should have been afraid of all along.